Let's move on to this concerning story now. The CCMA has been ordered, the PIC has been ordered by the CCMA to reinstate Matshepo More as its CFO. In October last year, you'll remember, the PIC board fired More after a disciplinary hearing into her conduct. She then took her employer to the CCMA, citing that the board did not follow due process when terminating her services. Analyst Khaya Sithole joins me now to talk more about this. And I mean, just to give some context, a very good evening to you, Khaya, to our viewers this evening. The reason the PIC board terminated the services of Ms. More at the time was because she was implicated in that PIC inquiry that we saw, where it said that she flouted proper procedures when it came into investment opportunities for the PIC and those invested within it. So your thoughts on the reinstatement that has to be done by the PIC?
Thank you, and good evening to your listeners. So the story is a bit complicated. We do know that a few years ago, there was the Party Commission of Inquiry, which was instituted by President Ramaphosa into looking into the affairs of the PIC. And of course, at that point in time, Matshepo More had been the chief financial officer, and Dr. Dan Matjila had been the chief executive officer of the PIC. And through those particular proceedings, we obviously got more insights into what had gone wrong at the PIC. But at that point in time, throughout the process, Matshepo More had actually been suspended. And her suspension actually prevailed for a very long time until, in their very last act as the interim board, the board that was chaired by Ruel Khoza simply told us that she had then been dismissed. She has then taken that process through the CCMA, and we now only discover from the CCMA process that actually it turns out that there were two charges that were put against her. The one is the one that a lot of people will probably be aware of that relates to the IO transaction, including Dr. Iqbal Survey and Dr. Dan Matjila. That was the one. And then there was another one that we refer to as the Leroke transaction, which is essentially a transaction involving people involved in VBS, which is a story for another day. It turns out that actually in the PIC's own disciplinary hearing, she was found not guilty in relation to the IO transaction, which is what a lot of people thought was going to be the big problem for her. And then in relation to the other transaction, what the disciplinary process had recommended is that she must get a final written warning. What the board of the PIC then did is that they changed that recommendation and they simply dismissed them. So what the CCMA has then had to deliberate on was firstly the question of whether she should have been charged in the first place. And in relation to that, the technicalities relate to the time it took from the moment the transaction was conducted in 2015 to the time that it took for the PIC to charge her, which is around a 5-year period. That is the first issue. The secondary issue is then the question of, well, having appointed an independent disciplinary process, and that process saying that actually, even if things have gone wrong, she must only get a final written warning. The board then simply ignored that recommendation and then decided that the dismissal is what they wanted. So on the basis of that, the CCMA has gone back and said, well, actually, we do find that there were a couple of problems in relation to that particular process. First, there was a prescription question of you took this action 5 years after the transaction that you said was a problem. And then secondly, on what basis do you then actually graduate the recommendation from the disciplinary inquiry from a final written warning to a dismissal? And on the basis of that, they've said, well, actually, this process needs to be reversed and she must be reinstated.
But isn't a recommendation, Khaya, just that, a recommendation? The board would have taken into account what was recommended by the inquiry at the time and then made a final decision as to what's best for the PIC. So I wonder if it's a strong enough argument to say, well, the recommendation was that she gets a final written warning.
Well, the important thing here is that if you are an organization or a board and have written a policy that says to you and I as an employee that, look, in case of disputes, we are going to take it through an independent process, and that the deliberations or the recommendations of that independent inquiry are binding, then they're actually binding on both of us. And in this case, it seems from my reading of the papers that I've received from the CCMA, it seems that the CCMA is saying that, well, the policy of the PIC was that if there's been an independent inquiry, the recommendations of that inquiry are binding on both parties. So the question that now has to be asked is to say, wait, hold on. If the recommendations, which are the final written warning and not a dismissal, if those recommendations are binding on both parties, on what basis did the board then simply say that we're going to graduate that recommendation that we got from the independent inquiry that we instituted then we decide to graduate to a dismissal. That is the problem that the PIC has to actually explain, to simply explain to us that, well, actually, are your policies binding? And if your policies say that this is the one thing that binds both parties that have been subject to this process, on what basis did the board then decide that actually we're going to ignore this and we're going to dismiss her?
Now, the PIC, Khaya, has indicated that they will be seeking advice on a way forward in this matter. In your view, do they have a leg to stand off? Is there any way they can maneuver and perhaps reverse the decision that's been made?
Well, I think from the reading of the papers from the CCMA, it's quite clear that the PIC has to deliberate on the question of what it did incorrect procedurally. And of course, according to these papers, it's simply a matter of two issues. The prescription question, in that you took far too long to institute this action in relation to an action that you said happened many years ago. That's the first issue. And the second one is the PIC needs to figure out a way around its own policy that simply says that, the recommendations of this independent tribunal, if you can call it that, are binding. So those are the first issues that the PIC has to deal with. I suppose the bigger problem, of course, is that it's probably not likely that Matshepo herself would be able to work with the PIC anyway, given the fact that she has been suspended for such a long time. And you can imagine that the current board, having been the ones that have overseen this particular process, will not have the appetite to say that she can come back and get her job back. But I think there's a very important issue here, in that up until now, Matshepo has been living under this cloud of everybody thinking that, well, she actually was part of a cabal that she and Dr. Dan ran at the PIC that actually engaged in a whole lot of very strange transactions. So she hasn't even been able to move on in her career in many ways, because everybody's been asking the question of why exactly has the PIC suspended you for so many years? And I think she has been vindicated by this particular ruling. And quite importantly, what this ruling has enabled us all to do is to finally realize that the big transaction, the problematic transaction relating to the IO deal, she was actually found not guilty by the PIC itself in relation to the actions that she may have undertaken in that particular deal. And I think for her as an individual and for her as a professional, these are remarkably important statements that have come from the CCMA, because I can imagine it's been remarkably difficult for her in the past few years to be able to even consider or countenance moving on to a different job on the basis that everybody says, until you can explain what happened at the PIC, you are absolutely untouchable.
Sure, very interesting insights, and there's so much more to unpack, Khaya, but that's all the time we have for this evening. Khaya Sithole, thank you very much for joining us this evening to speak about the ruling that the PIC has been ordered by the CCMA to hire its fired CFO, Matshepo More. Here's a look at